So this is my favourite part of our annual conference. Well, firstly, there's that build-up of seeing those wonderful artworks and the questions, and the difference in the questions from the long to the short, and the oohs and the ahs. But it's then really, really interesting to see how our great panel of experts then respond to those said questions. And you'll be pleased to know that we're not going to do 13 times 5, because I think we would certainly not have to worry about the train strike if that was the case, because we'd still be here next Monday. But what we'll do is it's going to be a bit like a some sort of mosh pit. You just have to sort of vie to be the first person that can answer a question, and then if there's somebody second that really wants to add to it, we'll take that sort of approach. And I'm sure that serendipitously it will all sort itself out. So just before we start, though, you have met some of our panel members, but not all. So do you want to just take it in turn, starting with Ben, to just introduce yourselves?
So hi, good afternoon. I'm Ben Farmer. I'm the Deputy Challenge Director for May Smarter Innovation at UKRI and Innovate UK.
Good afternoon. Hopefully some of you saw me this morning. My name is David Ray. I'm Chief Economist at JLL, which is a commercial property services company.
And I'm Adrienne Houston, the Managing Director of Eurovacuum Products Limited.
Sue Williams, Managing Director of Hexagon Consultants.
Hello, Fhaheen Khan. I'm a Senior Economist at Make UK. We are the trade body representing UK manufacturers.
Cool. So we're going to have to do this in an order, because otherwise, with my menopausal brain, I will forget the order that we're in. But we don't necessarily need to start at that end, so I'm going to suggest that we mix it up slightly, and we'll go this way to the end, and then that way to the end, okay? Because I should be able to manage that. So, this table, would you like to pose your question to the panel, please? Okay, one smart objective to achieve harmony in your workplace. Any takers? Here we go, Adrienne.
Cake on a Monday morning.
What did you say?
Cake.
Cake.
Generally I make some cakes for everyone.
On a Monday morning?
On a Sunday, and I'm taking a Monday morning.
Ah, we like that. That's a...
Maybe as a non-baker, I'll come in as I can't bake.
Oh. We weren't assuming anything, David.
No. From the research we've done from the property side, it's that collaboration, that communication between the workers and the bosses back to the workers, and really listening to what people want to make the workplace more collaborative, more innovative, just with greater emphasis on well-being. That, for us, was one of the things that's come out from various surveys.
And I think Jill touched on this morning. So last week, for some of you were there, we hosted National Manufacturing Day at Vitsu in Leamington Spa. And I think what really, really struck me about the Vitsu building, they thought very strategically about where they positioned it. So Leamington Spa is the centre of their sort of supply chain, but is also on the Chiltern line to London. Well, that's not my train line, but so they've still got connection back to London, which is where they were previously based. But what I didn't realise, can you remember those old factories, you'd have had them at JLR, where they were sort of very long, but then they had those sorts of roofs that were slanted and straight, slanted and straight, slanted and straight. And their roof was like that, and north-facing, so that they got all of the ambient light. So they said that for 70% of the day, they didn't need to use natural light. They also worked from 8 till 4, so that they maximised the natural light. There was a big area for bikes. And as Jill mentioned this morning, they had breakfast for everybody that worked together. So they came together as a community first thing in the day. They had 11s together, and then they had lunch together, so cake every day. But that supposedly some of the cakes, people had 6 on certain days when they made these specific things. All the food was free, because the important thing was that everybody came together. But I think they'd worked with a lot of different institutions around the design of the building. I think IFM and Steve Evans was particularly involved in it. But it really, really shows how the building design, and actually went back to some quite, I would say, old principles of how we used to build factories, could really, building on David and Adrienne's point, because there was a lot of cake in it, can really, really form that sense of community. So great question. Table at the back. Oh, you might, oh, here comes Angela with the mic. Oh, yours was the long question. Right, you just need to have good concentration heads on for this one. Ready?
Yeah, so our topic was environmental sustainability. So do you think that clear definitions and clear benefit, good measuring and clear regulation are the biggest impediments to truly embed sustainability into manufacturing firms' operation, especially small companies?
Okay, say all that again, because that was a lot.
So do you think that clear definitions and clear benefits, good measuring and clear regulations are the biggest impediments to truly embed sustainability into manufacturing firms' operations, especially into small firms?
Yep.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It was really interesting. So I don't know if it's the biggest impediment, but I think it's certainly a barrier from what we see from our manufacturing members. In fact, many of our members often say they don't necessarily know what metrics they need to use to measure their progress towards net zero. I mean, of course, there are some things they can measure, such as their carbon emissions and their scope 2 emissions, which is the emissions that their suppliers are producing. But it does become a barrier to growth when businesses are trying to grow and attract funds, finance and funding, and then suppliers or customers are often asking them, show us your credentials in sustainability, but actually there's often no definition behind what that means. So I think it's a challenge, but I think businesses are also working towards improving that. So there are new metrics that are coming out, such as how much investment goes into products that are clean, sustainable, how much waste they produce and how they're reducing that, and they're putting that, and so data collection has become a much bigger aspect of that. I think the more that they're able to collect data on how they produce, where they produce things, where they're sending goods and services, will be critical in the future. But I think at the moment it is a bit of a barrier for growth.
So, and this might not be one, but I think digitalisation might have a role in this one.
Well, absolutely. I mean, is it the biggest impediment? That's a very good question. I honestly don't know. It's certainly a particularly substantial one, though, so yeah, it's certainly up there. But what I would say is that don't let the lack of standardization and regulation stop people, whoever you are and whichever size of organization or type of organization, from just doing something in the right direction. Don't wait for that regulation to be there. And is digital an enabler? Definitely. I mean, it's an enabler to doing something more efficiently at the on a particular machine at a very smallest scale, through to the optimization of really complex supply chains. And I think as we especially go through to re-engineering and re-architecting those supply chains to facilitate circularity, that those standardization impediments become even more critical. But there is also then the role of digital and data in unlocking what we can do there. So I was having a conversation with someone at lunchtime, a PhD student, about should the textiles industry embrace digitalization? Well, absolutely, yes. There are lots of different reasons for doing that. One of the reasons, though, is for circularity and sustainability and understanding the provenance of textiles. And digital is such a fantastic tool for generating and sharing provenance data. So does that need standardization? Absolutely. But don't wait to share data and those insights whilst those standards appear. Just do the right thing.
Yeah. Just to build on that again with Vitsu, Vitsu builds a product that will last forever. And essentially their sort of product, it's various types of shelving and seating, but if you move house, you can reconfigure it by buying extra bits or moving it. Now, we were also talking yesterday with Tasha about some projects that the AHRC had done with, I think it was Harris Tweed. So some of the issue with some of these smaller bespoke SMEs that have got these very high-end products is they're not democratized, not everybody could use them. But actually, if we use digitalization to servitize them so that everybody could afford a Vitsu shelving system or a Harris Tweed jumper, not only do we support principles of circularity, because we could keep things for longer, but also we're buying things once and we're using them for life, which is perhaps the best way of all, just thinking about some of the things that Martin was saying this morning in his presentation about achieving a more sustainable future. So sometimes we have the solutions, but they might be in high-end things that at the moment aren't available to everybody. And I think digitalisation can help democratise some of those products so that they could be affordable through a different type of business model to everybody. Okay, are you ready, this table?
Thank you. So our topic was about equality, diversity, and inclusion. And our question was, how would you embed equality, diversity, and inclusion principles within digital ecosystems to promote a more resilient and productive workforce?
Okay. Who'd like to go first with this one? Okay. Yeah? It's good,
okay.
because as Adrienne said this morning, women alone cannot do it.
I think that's a really interesting question, especially the way you phrased it in terms
50-50?
of managing the actual, because you can have decision makers and try to make them better at choosing or try to ensure that EDI is a priority for the business. But if you're, let's say, transitioning to more digitalized processes and you're using technologies that are maybe automating hiring processes, recruitment, that sort of thing, or we actually have a member who's been using ChatGPT to write job descriptions, and so then that creates some risks about, we have seen evidence of the way you might write a job description can deter women from applying for certain jobs or men from applying for certain jobs. I think it's really more about ensuring that you still maintain some sort of oversight of the use of those technologies, especially in these situations, because it is very difficult to necessarily control them. You can produce all the algorithms you want to try and ensure that those biases are not embedded within the systems, but it is very difficult to avoid. And so some human element needs to maintain in touch with that process. So I think that's what the advice I would give to businesses, that don't get rid of all your HR stuff because your AI can do it on its own. You need to make sure that human element stays a part of that process.
Anyone else want to comment?
Well, I can't. There's all sorts of things you can do to embed better ED&I practice, and I think for our challenge, we developed a strategy to do this for ourselves. And there are things that you can control. So there are decisions you can make about how you might write a job description, your recruitment decisions, who you invite to meetings, who you invite to speak. There are opportunities that you can create for people every day. You can go more broadly. You can start to set an example. So as an organisation and what we do, I hope we try to set an example for showing inclusive and behaviours and generating opportunities for lots of different people. And then eventually you can go to those more macro arguments around the business case and the ethical reasons for doing things. And I think if we embrace all of those things, we'll get in there in the right direction.
And I think sometimes it's about being reflective. So with InterAct, when we first set out and did our first systematic lit review call, the majority of the applications came from a really small number of universities. Who's here from Aston? Yay. So Aston actually have a really strong background in manufacturing. I think they actually have, across their different departments, about 100 people that are involved in some aspect of manufacturing. And they've actually got some really good academics. So it wasn't surprising that they were going to be some of the early adopters of InterAct. We sort of agonised, didn't we, at first, which is this problematic? Because Aston, or what we seem to be getting, not a disproportionate share, but a good share. But we reflected on it, and we had governance in place to reflect on it with ESRC and the broader challenge. But we then also reflected on who else was applying and not being successful. And we identified, for instance, there was a lot of people maybe from the less research-intensive universities that had really good ideas but didn't know how to write bids as well. So then we ran a bid writing workshops so that we could level up the playing field, because we didn't want how well you wrote a bid to be what necessarily got you funded, though obviously when you've got to have an objective process, you do need that. But also being able to write bids doesn't just mean to say you won an InterAct grant. Hopefully I can already see from people in the room that you've won an InterAct grant and then you've gone on to apply for bigger grants or other grants. So actually we're capacity building by helping people to write grants. But it feels particularly pleasing when you're perhaps, what we've begun to see is that our money that we're distributing is going to different institutions in different parts of the country. And that's good to see. but that came from consciously reflecting, we have got gender balance on our panel, yay, but we perhaps don't have any other sort of balances. Obviously not everyone can bake. I'll make sure I ask that question next time. So sometimes it's about, you might not get it perfect to begin with, but it's then taking the time to reflect and to move on. And I have to say, I think Made Smarter Innovation have done a great job at providing an environment to enable that to happen. A good question. Next group. Back table.
We've been hearing about the importance of listening. Jill told us earlier about that employees want to have a voice, so that's great. But at the end of the day, the company needs to work together to produce, to make what they're supposed to do and what they paid for. So how do we balance employee voice and all the creativity that comes from it, and the need for organization harmony on the other hand?
And the need for?
Harmony in the organization, productivity.
Okay. Adrienne? Sue's already said she's wanting the data questions.
Oh, okay.
See, she's waiting. That's what I did at Sports Day one year. I wanted to do the obstacle race, but I was always so keen that I'd always put my hand up with the first race, like 100 metres, and then when it came to the obstacle race, they'd never choose me. It took me 5 years of primary school to work out you don't put your hand up at all and you wait for the obstacle race.
Now I forgot the question.
Sorry.
No, I was just joking. I was on that table. The management style and employee voice. I think, as I said, as I opened out my presentation, I think what is key is to create a culture where everybody feels included and safe. I worked in many corporate, FTSE 100 and NASDAQ 250, where they didn't really care about me. And when I set up my business, as I said, I wanted to provide the best solution for my customers because they didn't care about their customers either. So I knew what I wanted. I knew how I wanted to start my business. And providing the best solution for my clients and putting them and my colleagues and my suppliers, we're all a team. Just because they're not on my payroll doesn't mean that we don't work together. So I listen to them as well as I listen to my customers. So creating a culture where we all feel safe to voice our feelings and our opinions, but equally I have to direct and maneuver around too much whinging and moaning because we have a job to do. But ultimately, I think we have to feel safe, and I know how it feels not to feel safe, and therefore that's my priority.
Can buildings help you feel safe?
I would say safe from the weather. So, I mean, the first bit of the conference that I managed to attend, there was this running theme that it's all about people, and for me, real estate is about that. It's about the spaces that people occupy, that they live in, that they use. So yes, buildings, the spaces that we use are instrumental to that, but really it comes back to the culture, the DEI, the alignment between management and the workers. So from my limited experience, it's spaces matter, but it's really culture that matters more.
Yeah, I didn't get a chance to address the first question, and these two are linked. I think some of the answer to this was in the first presentation this morning, and then what followed later about what's important to people at work. And the things I took away from that were trust and empowerment. If you have trust, you can communicate safely, and if you're empowered, you can go and do things. And that's effective in whatever size of organisation you might be in. I think there's an interesting then intersection into digital. And I think we've all probably been through the pandemic, and then, I mean, I'm field-based and my colleagues are field-based. The technology is a great enabler for people to go and do things, but you can't look over the shoulder, and you don't want to because you trust them. But it does mean you do feel trusted when you are empowered by technology to go and do things out of sight. However, we do see through our competitions scenarios where that isn't so clear. So the use of technology for example, gamification of workplace activities, that's a really interesting ethical challenge to navigate. And as an organisation, we don't take a view on what's the right ethical route to take. But what we'd like to see and ask to see is that the applicants have thought about the ethical situation and have provided a thoughtful response to it. It's a great thing that they have in their applications when they're successful. So I think those two things of trust and empowerment are really important for Harmony. But technology comes in both positive and potentially quite negative ways. And I think as we go forward, we're going to have to navigate that more and more.
A minor point, but a quick point, but as a woman who's worked in a multitude of manufacturing environments, I can definitely say that buildings do contribute to whether you feel safe or not, or whether you feel you can contribute and collaborate, most definitely. So I think it's all of those factors, but definitely buildings are a factor of that.
Yeah, and I suppose maybe part of the reason I also raised it links into digitalisation and trust in the way that we work, but especially post-COVID, trying to get this balance between sort of a hybrid working. But I know at our thought leadership dinner that Jill and the Strathclyde team hosted last week on National Manufacturing Day, one of the discussions we had was around flexible working, and it was actually talked about actually one of the ways to encourage people to work in manufacturing was that flexibility, and that perhaps we'd end up with a 4-day week. But also people like not to have to come in, but actually there are elements of doing a job in manufacturing, which means that people do need to come in. So therefore they need, to Sue's point, it's about, and we saw it, it's about creating then that physical space that's a joy to be in. And I don't know about your organisations. I work at a university where academics love their own offices, and the thought that, but we can have a building that's empty. So from a sustainability perspective, it's a nightmare, but the thought of then getting better building utilisation maybe through having collaborative workspaces or shared offices or sharing offices in different ways can pose some challenges. I think the conclusion we came to about how you get flexibility for people in manufacturing was maybe that you'd have to shorten the working week so they got their flexibility by not being there. But it creates a divide, doesn't it, when you have people that do have to physically be somewhere to do their role versus those that perhaps they work within the manufacturing context but don't have to be in a specific location. Okay, so I think we're now onto this table.
Right, thank you. So our topic was well-being. We've got a question. So how do we find a way to ensure the human being is adequately valued in a world or company where a robot or AI could be used to outperform them or control them?
Oof. That's a good question, and I think it's something that a lot of people think about. I mean, in general, our research shows that robots and AI don't really replace workers anyway. They tend to replace tasks for a worker, and then that gives an opportunity for workers to maybe redeploy their time to other efforts. But I think our surveys often show that cultural differences and social challenges within the workplace is often a barrier to adoption for technologies, because there often is pushback from employees because of that fear that they themselves don't understand that they would not necessarily be replaced by those machines. We have examples of businesses who have actually actively engaged with their workforce very early on, those who have successfully automated processes. To give you an example, by involving the workers in choosing the machines that they will work with, which is what we've seen done quite successfully with some of our members, and we thought that was actually a very good way to approach the situation where, as a manager, you may be deciding on 3 or 4 different pieces of equipment and actually letting the employees choose what do you think will be best for the business, lets them play a role and empowers them to choose to protect their own jobs, but also to improve their business, because that's what they also want.
Yeah.
So it's a really important question. Is that working? And I think one thing, though, is to not get too down the hype cycle with it. Someone I know very well would refer to a certain technology as artificial stupidity. I'm a strong advocate for AI machine learning, but there are very clear limitations to what it can do, what robotics can do. And I think the challenge that we face as we shift towards more circular activities in manufacturing will inevitably lead to more variability in inputs and our processes, and the challenge will just get harder and harder. And so as we substitute, in quotes, the easier activities, the more repetitive it came up this morning, of those activities, there are plenty of other things to do to engage the human brain with. So it's something we need to be careful with. We need to be really careful with the unintended consequences. It's a question for our roadmap down the end on that table. We need to be really careful because there's a multiplier effect of those unintended consequences, which we'll cover later, but also not to be too optimistic about what technology can achieve, and that's coming from me. So,
yeah, David.
I just come in from a purely economics perspective rather than a real estate one, and this is taking an apocalyptic view of it.
That's not like Economist.
No, dismal science. If technology were to, that ChatGPT were to replace so many jobs, economies would collapse. It replaces jobs, people aren't able to work, then the whole system doesn't work. So I completely agree with the points made in the question and the other speakers on the panel. It's augmentative, it's additive. There's so many examples of artificial intelligence, ChatGPT, enhancing productivity, people working together with technology to achieve much better outcomes. I completely agree. It's not going to work to replace people. And if it were to go down that apocalyptic route, it wouldn't make sense from an economic point of view. So before you even got there, it'd be regulated out of use.
Yeah, and I think that's what Ben Armstrong from MIT was saying this morning, that it's foolish to say, is it robots or humans? The solution has to be how people and robots work together.
Cyborgs.
Yeah, I don't know where she's gone. I was going to ask Linda because, where is she? Oh, God, that's really shamed her, hasn't it? Of all the moments, I suggest to ask Linda. Do you want to comment about your project? Because it's looking specifically, specifically at this sort of aspect, isn't it? Yeah, the people-led digitalisation, your project.
Yeah, so specifically...
I'm giving you a plug.
Oh, thank you, thank you. So I'm Deputy Director of the Made Smarter Innovation Centre for People-Led Digitalisation. So we're looking at the people and cultural barriers to the adoption of digital technologies. At the end of it, hopefully, we will come up with the PLD, People-Led Digitalisation approach. So this is what you do if you want to put people before technology.
Brilliant, thank you.
Thanks
Sorry
very
to
much.
put you on the spot. Right then, I think we're with our last question down this end, aren't we? Are you there, Stephen?
Thank you so much. I think because Mike forced us to do a cartoon, I should be miming this question. But maybe that's a bit cruel, especially difficult with one hand. But our question is around employment models, which we felt should be flexible and support innovation, be good for workers and employees, and be progressive. So imagine a roadmap, that roadmap avoiding traps. So if I had hands, I'd be animating all of that. But our question, to get to the point, is what do the panel think are the key things to get right on the road to a great employment model?
Legislation is, again, what I addressed. The UK has no legislation in place for the gig platform working. IR35, which is my favorite because I love it, but I can't do anything about it. And ultimately, I think we need to encourage people to be entrepreneurs, whether it's also from a very young age, not just into manufacturing, but also in every aspect of life. And they can only become entrepreneurs if we, not everybody will be able to apply for grants and receive them or investment. We need to encourage them to think more as an individual, but participate to the bigger economy.
So what legislation change would you like to see?
Protection for these. We all seen and heard about the Uber drivers that went to court about time of sick. We do need the protection for these and the social charter to allow people to become brave enough to do it on their own.
So it's providing that underpinning sort of safety mechanism as if you're in full-time employment, but you're in the gig economy, but you get the sort of benefits of both worlds.
Yes, exactly.
Cool. I just thought I'd check.
Students, I mean, I work with many of them, and I know how interested they are in running their own businesses. But starting a business is not so easy and quite daunting without backup of someone or an organisation. So the spin-outs are very good, but the spin-outs need to do a lot of work before, and they need the investment. So I'm not talking that level, but just in general to allow students and youngsters to find employment after a graduation and university.
Brilliant. Other perspectives?
So it's a bit unfair because it was my table. But I think one of the really important things on that roadmap, and it was my point, so I guess I'll just repeat it though, is that we need to be also, not just like riding a bike, you need to be really, you want to keep your eye on where you want to go, because if you look at the rock, you hit it. But equally, we need to know where the rocks are. We need to know what to avoid and what the unintended consequences are. So back to that earlier point is that there will be winners and losers from this transition, and so this just transition. So we need to understand what work will be displaced and what are the cohorts of people who are in those displaced groups, so that we can work ahead to think, what do we do either with a social response through training or even a technology response to facilitate an improved working scenario for those people, because it's probably likely the underprivileged groups in society who will be most impacted by these changes. And so that's what I meant by this multiplier effect. The negative side has a disproportionately negative consequence for some people, and I think that's something that we need to be very aware of.
Any other thoughts? No? So have I got all the questions from this end? I think so. So we'll start going back this way then. So we'll start with...
Thank you. So our topic was, how do we go from profit to people, from economic to social, and get that triple bottom line of people, profit and planet. So the question is, do we really think that the world is ready for the level of global disruption needed to truly reconfigure to get to a real circular economy? And if so, how? Ooh.
Very quick thoughts, I think, because I'm not an expert on this, but I don't know if anyone really is. I don't think the world is ever ready for that kind of shock, but I mean, it's the evolution that usually takes place post that shock that needs to happen anyway. To give you an example of, obviously, we've all went through the pandemic, and I'm not saying that every country dealt with that in the best way possible, but there was a lot of evolution and changes that took place during the pandemic that changed the way we work, that changed the way we do meet productivity and goals and businesses. And actually, the shock itself was the thing that had to ignite the changes. So, I don't think there are really any steps you can define to prepare the world to be ready for something that has to happen. But actually, the events must happen first for the world to respond to it after the fact. That's more of an opinion rather than no research.
Quite philosophical.
I'll come in next. I completely agree, but I would say that the world isn't one place, and already you've got almost like the technology adoption curve. You've got places and companies and industries that are massively far progressed in this and are light years ahead of others. And at the opposite end of the spectrum, you've got companies that are burying their head in the sand, countries, governments that are burying their heads in the sand to try to avoid it. So is the world ready? No, but there is also already massive examples of adoption, change, progress happening, and that it's building momentum. to take the example of COVID, go back to before COVID and you had the Extinction Rebellion protests in London. And that, at the time, from a real estate perspective, the embedding of net zero carbon targets or commitments to the science-based target initiatives was incredibly low. But it was around that time that it started to pick up, and it's just continued to gain momentum. But there remains that massive spectrum of adoption and interest and willingness to move away from that pure profit for shareholders line into the whole profit, people, planet, triple bottom line. Even trying to some of the other points that were made, trying to find the ways of measurements that companies can commit to say, look, well, this is what we're doing on people, what we're doing on planet, in a way that's consistent, and those targets are acceptable to investors, to employees, to talent that they're trying to recruit. So it's a long road, but there are so many examples that can give us excitement about where this change can come.
And actually, in a way, that's part of InterAct's role in the Made Smarter innovation landscape. So part of our role is to help to depict what that future is that we want in 2040, and to inspire people to take some of the bolder steps towards it. So hopefully it won't be very long. We're just finalising the forward, aren't we? But we'll be able to share with you our scenarios for 2040 piece of research, which has over 40 different snapshots of what some of those ideal futures could look like. Some of them dial up more if your number one driver is resilience, or it's about well-being, or it's about productivity, or it's about sustainability. But fundamentally, when you look at those, there's one driver that comes into it. And interestingly, we've run lots of workshops using them. We've run one in the West Midlands looking at electric vehicles. We run some last week at Vitso looking at furniture. For those of you who, there's so many digital manufacturing events, but the one in Liverpool last year, wasn't it? No, the year before in November, I get confused. But whenever we run them, interestingly, and where's Nikolai, there he is. But whenever we start them, the thing that comes out, and we look at all the different drivers, starting to look at it political, economic, social, technological, the one driver it starts with is changing consumer behaviour. The change starts actually with us potentially making different purchasing decisions, but not just us, actually probably the Daily Mail reader. Because there's a lot of people making a lot of purchasing decisions that then drive the change, equally the way that financial analysts value organisations. So if suddenly the stock price of an organisation plummeted because of some of their slightly less ethical practices, it might inspire that company to do something a bit different. And in fact, we've just got great news today, didn't we, about a paper that's been accepted, which is looking at the role of shame in driving some change. So I would agree with you. I think we have to be bold and take the steps, and it will happen. It won't necessarily be everybody at once, but you're here today because we're trying to, create that movement. That, Extinction Rebellion started in which town in the UK? Anybody? No. Whoa. Stroud. Where do I come from? Stroud. We're going to be the Extinction Rebellion of manufacturing.
Just to reinforce that point, to really say that the evidence that I have that things are definitely different. And in the last year, I deal with a lot of private equity businesses and different conversations. They are absolutely having ESG as part of their financial assessment criteria. And that wouldn't have been the case a few years ago. That wouldn't have been one of their key criteria. So, and the fact that they were asking different people about what they thought should be part of that criteria and how to assess it was like quite a wow moment for me, that finally it's kind of really getting into the establishment, and it will therefore, I think, continue to build.
Right then. So this, I think, we're coming up to a question you might want. It's that table there. So keep hold of the mic, Sue. This is the obstacle race.
So how do you orchestrate collaboration?
Okay, this is definitely one I have an opinion on, for sure. So I'll speak about it through the lens, for me, of a manufacturing business, and being my background being planning. So I think there's several things that prevent collaboration in an organisation that need addressing. Functional silos being one of those things. The fact that you've got misaligned KPIs. So I think coming back to Jan's point from her presentation earlier around that strategic alignment and really making sure that the top is connected all the way through to the bottom and back up again through various routes around what traditionally may have been the role of S&OP and other planning mechanisms, but broadening that out to include the people agenda and some of those other key agendas is crucial within the organisation. When we start to move outside of just the confines of one organisation, we've really got to get over the concept that collaboration is a risk of commercial sharing, loss of information. I was involved in the vaccine task force, and we had a massive issue with getting some of the information we needed about the supply chain in case one of the other pharma companies got some information about their supply chain. So, I mean, we've got to move past the retention of information because of perceived risk rather than the reality and the actual benefits that everyone could gain from that sharing. So I think there's strategic alignment and breaking some of those old perceptions.
Yeah, and I totally agree. Integrated business planning and some of those forms of planning, particularly if you could build it in around sustainability goals, is one of the critical ways to maintain strategic alignment. Ben?
Well, it's kind of the mission of Innovate UK, at least it's been a strapline at some point, I think, around Connect and Catalyse. It's been the mantra of the organisation is to facilitate collaboration. And there's all sorts of mechanisms being developed to do that. But I mean, essentially, I guess what they all have in common is creating creative collision. So getting people together like today that wouldn't normally meet, and people exchange ideas and go off and work together. I was just having a conversation with Vania this morning about, can we actually, after facilitating those, we're doing some things in the challenge of connecting. There's a real hot spot of tech activity in London, particularly around AI and machine learning, which the data says isn't very well orientated to manufacturing. We start to create events that bring those communities together. Just having a chat with Vania to see whether we can measure the consequence, the output of doing that. Do we see patterns start to emerge as a consequence of doing those things where we connect geographies? So we can do things to make those collaborations happen at quite a macro level. And I think, to be honest, I think from the feedback I understand about Innovate UK is that other nations really admire the model that we have here in the UK. There are some issues with it. So the scale-up funding, for example, is something that is a bit missed. But yeah, so I think there's plenty we can do and we are doing.
Great. Other table, if we go to where Angela is at the moment, that table with Jingju.
Hi, so this question goes back to harnessing data. And the question is, how do we ensure that the ownership and the handling of data doesn't undermine the societal goods that manufacturing can deliver?
Yeah, this was another, seriously, the obstacle. This is the second half of the obstacle race.
This is it. I will have now peaked, and that's it. So, so I think with anything to do with data and anything to do when we start to talk about digital capabilities such as AI, we've really got to make sure we're looking at things through the lens of responsibility. And I think it's really crucial that if we're going to get the best out of data, one of my favourite posts I've ever saw on LinkedIn said, if you torture the data long enough, it'll tell you anything. So it's really important that we get the right structures and infrastructure in place that has validation and control over those data sets, and also that responsible lens, so that we're making sure that we're not allowing bias, that we're not allowing hallucinations, that we're not allowing, and that the outcomes that we're getting out of it are actually valid. And that's a really crucial part of at an organisation and at a government level.
Anything anyone wants to add? Go, Ben.
I mean, I think I mean, I've been in the situation before in the private sector where you put a lot of money and time into a project and develop some really interesting proprietary data. You do not want to share it. It's your competitive advantage there. However, there are scenarios where you may wish to, and one of the experiments we're running with the challenge is the Smart Manufacturing Data Hub, where they have a manufacturing data exchange platform, the MDEP. It's a data cooperative for SMEs to share their data. So it's shared in a way where ownership is retained at the company, but the insights that result from the aggregation of data across lots of different companies are then shared between those who share the data. And so there's a degree of sharing because the data is understood by a neutral third party and then given back again. But the insights that come out of it can be shared for everyone's mutual benefit. So we're running this now. It's a big experiment to see commercially, can we make the case? Can we convince companies that that is something they want to do? And that's something we're doing right now. And if you're interested, have a look at smdh.uk.
The other, just on the data side, another Made Smarter Innovation funded project, Carbon View, that was exploring that rather than quite often competition between companies comes because of cost. So people don't want to share their data because they think there's a commercial side to it. You've seen this at JLR. So some of it's looking at if we start to convert that into a discussion around carbon, and that has a mutual benefit of minimising the carbon across the entire supply chain, is that a different way to foster collaboration because you're taking it away from the sort of commercial aspects? So I think it's about thinking creatively, isn't it? These different solutions that just take a different angle.
Yeah, just a little bit on that. I think it's a really important question especially on ownership of data. I think there's a lot of questions around, for example, if a business was using, let's say, a Sage software to record data, then is the data necessarily owned by the company or is it owned by the owner of the software? So I think there is a lot of issues around that, and it's a big concern or question mark for policy and government in terms of regulations as well. Actually, this is something that's probably going to evolve over time. We already have some like reporting standards, for example, already exist for many existing data, such as, let's say, gender pay reporting gaps for businesses of certain sizes. If you're, as a business, collecting sensitive data on consumer use of your products, or what businesses or where businesses are buying your products, or where you're sending, for example, if you're importing materials from questionable countries, sometimes that happens, you know, at the moment, if the regulation doesn't necessarily require you to report it, you might not have to, but then these things could evolve over time, which could require businesses to start reporting on the data they collect as it becomes more advanced. So I think it's an area of interest for many manufacturers at the moment.
Yeah, definitely. Right, this table.
Can we think global and national instead of global versus national?
So can we be global and national rather than global or national?
I'm happy to start that off. I mean, I think for the UK that went out the window a couple of years ago, so we're more we're all about versus rather than collaboration. I think, look, there are certain goals that the world shares that I think is important in terms of collaboration, such as achieving net zero and dealing with climate change. But for many countries, it is also a race to attract investment, to create jobs in those new industries. And so whilst, you know, we share different goals, competition is a way to enhance the acceleration of reaching those goals. So it actually, whilst versus might sound quite conflicting, that it might be almost counterproductive to growth, that competition that the UK has with Europe and the US, with especially what the US is doing with the Inflation Reduction Act, is designed to almost incentivize us to progress faster towards these goals. So ultimately, I think the versus is not necessarily a bad thing. I think that there are some positives to it, but I'm sure that we can also come up with negatives if we look really hard.
Any other perspectives? I have one, which is funded by Ben. So InterAct actually has a global arm, so we've got InterAct Global. But actually, so the work that we did looking at the future digital manufacturing ecosystem for the UK, we're now replicating, looking at what that means for global value chains. And actually, this is going to feed into a study that's being done by the World Economic Forum, who also want to look at what the future of global value chains is going to look like. I perhaps have a slightly different view. I think different countries have a different role to play in global value chains, which will be partly determined by what's in their, you know, what assets they have in the ground, or what they could potentially get back to their country through recycling or reuse. It's going to be, this is the part that Vanya's looking at, it's going to be about some of the economic differences between those organisations, and what the Strathclyde team are looking at is what it also means in terms of the differences of people. And maybe I'm slightly idealistic, but in an ideal world, we would have global value chains where every country in the world is playing to its strengths and can be part of that, a global value chain network where everybody in the world has the basic things that they need at an affordable price, which is a lofty ambition from where we currently are. So hopefully this time next year, we might have some initial findings from what that work's beginning to show. Jill? Brilliant.
UN agreement, the Sustainable Development Goals, which I think every country signed up to.
Yeah. I have to say, personally, I feel quite worried or shocked by the American perspective, the anti-inflationary bill. When you go there, when they talk about deglobalization, and the worst thing they ever did was move manufacturing to China, and the sort of anti-China sentiment, it doesn't feel very nice, but maybe I just live in a sort of flowery world and it's the reality of how things are. Okay, last two tables, this table there.
Thank you. So our question is how to inspire next generations to explore opportunities in the manufacturing sector.
Ooh.
A lot of work going on in the 4 to 11 year groups. There's a scheme called STEM Ambassadors, where engineers and STEM people working in STEM have to do 2 outreach, primary or secondary school level. Also, I don't know if you're familiar with the Scout movement, but the Scouts have actually adopted now a new badge, which is the digital badge.
Ooh.
So no longer about sewing and cutting, they are now doing programming as well. And so there's a lot of investment, whether it's resources or financial, into that age group. And then it goes out the window when you go into secondary school, because as I said, there are no teachers. And there is definitely a lack of teachers in STEM sciences. So, but the other thing that we haven't talked about is language. We need to change the language and how we speak about manufacturing. I think, Joe, you and your colleagues touched on it last week, that we must change some of the terminology around manufacturing, and even you question whether we should call it manufacturing. So, we have to challenge the stereotype and we have to move forward, but I think the language is something that we must address because engineering covers so much.
I'd agree. Jill, do you want to say anything? No? Okay. All right, and then last table, last but not least.
Thanks. So this probably follows on quite nicely from the last topic of our topic was upskilling and lifelong learning. So the question we came up with is, how do you expect the relationship between academia and the private sector to evolve with the pace of changing technology within the workplace?
Well, this is where the Academy of Engineering, Royal Academy of Engineering, is doing a fantastic job, because they're funding every year probably about 70 visiting professorships, which means that people from industry go and work at a higher education setting. Certainly, I'm one of those, and I enjoy it so much I actually do pro bono in one of them, because, again, it comes down to language, academics, and in this room, it's full of academics, and that's why it took me back this morning when I saw I expected more industrialists here. But there's definitely a gap between interpreting requirements from the academics and the industry, and that is why this scheme from the academy is superb, because with having more people from industry and talking industrial language allows academics to formulate the curricula in such a way that it responds to the requirements of the industry.
Yeah, I think one opportunity is to change the way that academics are measured, the KPIs around research assessment, REF, which is REF now, isn't it? Yeah. and the emphasis on impact on publications, I think more than ever, it makes it very difficult to transition between academia and industry, or more so from industry into academia, because once you've been employed in industry for some years, you don't have that statistic behind you to be able to then progress. So I think if we can find ways to allow the transitioning of people in careers between those environments, that will help cross-fertilise what is going on and what are the real problems that industry are facing.
Yeah, so I mean, I was very fortunate. So I moved from industry to academia when I was 30, actually as a way of having better work-life balance, to have a family. I thought it was going to be easier to be a working mum, and it probably was true. But I'm not sure I could do it now because I didn't have a PhD, but I could still be a research fellow without a PhD, and that's not possible anymore. You could be a project engineer, so I think IFM sort of has it with their consultancy side of things, WMG has it with, they have a whole, probably about 200 people they employ as project engineers that can do that, a more applied side of research where more of this CR&D type of grants sit. But it does require institutions to have a slightly different mindset. But more than that, it requires academics, I think, to truly practice EDI and be inclusive. I mean, so I'm an engineer that's now the dean of a business school, but for a long, long time, especially when I was at Warwick, you know, people in the business school would look down their nose at me. I can remember when I joined, there was a guy in the business school that my partner works in the business school, and he looked at his CV and he goes, well, she would barely have got an assistant professor here, because they didn't value my research grants, they didn't value my work with industry, they didn't value some of my papers because they weren't allegedly world elite. And they were actually read by people. And so I think one of the reasons for me moving to become dean of a business school is to create a business school that actually wants to work with business. And our strategy, we have a new strategy which is called Progress with Purpose by 2030. We want to be a business school that purpose-led people and organisations want to work with, but actually that really starts with the culture, because what that means is we need everyone within the school to value scholarship in all of the different varieties in which it could occur. And ultimately, everything that we do should have a purpose. It should be making a difference to the world. And I appreciate that might not be the same for all academic disciplines, but I think certainly when you're in a business school, that doesn't seem like it's an unreasonable thing to want to achieve. Yet business schools can be some of the worst for having this hierarchy of papers or judging people in that sort of way.
I was just going to follow up with a question to you of where are there good examples? Because I know from when we would have met from Jaguar Land Rover and Warwick Manufacturing Group, is that a good example? Is Loughborough with whoever, which manufacturings you work with, is that a...
So if I look, I think IFM's a good example, WMG's a good example, Cranfield's good examples, Aston's good examples. They're where you get this blend between people that have probably had some sort of industrial background, so and then they've gone into academia, but unfortunately, it probably is historically at an early enough stage that they missed some of the stuff that now sideswipes them. And I think going forward, we need to make it easier for people to transition into these roles, perhaps at a slightly different career stage. It's a bit like your idea of sort of flexible working, but in a different sort of way. And universities are creating roles like, there's now a role that's quite often, there's professors of practice. They tend to only be at the professor level, but maybe you could be an associate professor of practice or an assistant professor of practice, so that there's career route in. Some of the other barriers are salary, because if you've been in industry earning a fortune and then essentially you're starting at the beginning again, but maybe there's ways that we can bridge that. But actually, one of the most innovative ways that was suggested to me years ago when I first was a researcher, it was from the director of R&D at Philips. He said, what we need is collaborations between consultancies, firms and universities, and essentially your career just moves between them, because actually most of the time we're trying to fix the same problems but just with a different perspective. So actually, if we just had these sorts of collaborative networks, why can't we almost have like an employment passport? And, you know, I could be working for Loughborough this week, but maybe Capgemini next week and JLL the week after, you know, maybe not quite weekly, but you get this sort of drift. So lots to think about. Right then, 2 minutes late now. Never mind, but we're going to end on time. First and foremost, can we have a massive round of applause for our amazing panel?